But eventually I was talking with two guys at this restaurant, and they wouldn't give me their names. Finally, I said, yeah, I'm interested in what it's like to be a Muslim in the United Kingdom since October 7th. And one of the guys, his eyes got really narrow, and he said, what happened on October 7th? And I knew I was in trouble. Brian, I know why the caged Dimmy sang.
Reporting from JerusalemForEndTimes.com, this is Brian Schrauger. What is it like to live in Israel? Well, more and more you can see for yourself by stepping out your own front door. In the broadest sense, Israel is a Jewish state, surrounded, even inhabited by, devotees of Islam. But Islam is not staying in the East. Today, it is exploding in the West. Both the UK and the US have thousands of mosques. In fact, in the United States of America, Islam is projected to be the nation's second largest religious affiliation by the year 2040. Right now, however, today, there are approximately 3,000 mosques in the US and roughly 1,500 in the UK. If you live in a major city, it is virtually certain that at least one mosque is there. In America's Northeast and West, there are many, many more. Living in Israel means daily interaction with people who are Muslims. They are doctors, judges, taxi cab drivers, high-tech executives, grocery store stockers, fellow passengers on buses, trains, and planes. They are colleagues in virtually every line of work. They are neighbors, and they're friends. For some, it's easy to think that all Muslims are alike, that all of them want to destroy Israel and the West. That simply isn't true. Well, perhaps not simply. In fact, there are at least as many varieties of Islam as there are Christianity. Also, in the broadest sense, however, there are two big divisions in the Muslim world. They are Islam and Islamism. On each side of this divide, there are hundreds or more variations, but in general, there are radical fundamentalists, aka Islamists, and mainstream devotees of Islam. Radical Muslims, Islamists, are a clear minority of the approximately 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. They are in the minority, but they have the loudest voice. The complexity of living among people who have very different beliefs than those you and I hold dear is the everyday reality of Jews throughout history. In other words, it is a very Jewish kind of challenge. Learning how to live with Muslims in the workplace, in the market, and in the neighborhood begins with understanding that not all of them are alike. They are unique individuals, and they belong to one of several thousand expressions of Islam. Today, we step back to take a look at the big division, the one between Islam and Islamism. We are continuing a conversation with Dexter Van Zile, a scholar who today works for the nonprofit organization, the Middle East Forum. Under their umbrella, Dexter is the managing editor of a publication called Focus on Western Islamism. What better person to explore the issue of Islam, Islamism, and you? Join me as we do that very thing.
My impression is that Islam is a lot like Christianity in that there are many different divisions or groups of Islam. You know, in Christianity, we would say there are different theologies, there are different denominations, either the Eastern Orthodox, or the liberals, or conservatives. And is the same thing not true with respect to Islam? Are there not many different? Yes, there are an awful lot of different divisions within the faith and different practices and different faith traditions within the larger faith of Islam. And there are disagreements about how to interpret the Quran and how to apply the message of Islam to modern life. And we, at the Middle East Forum, we basically tell people this is the message: is that Islam is a 1,400-year-old religion that has a whole bunch of different interpretations and different methods of being practiced. And Islamism is an ideology that basically erupted about 100 years ago. And this Islamism is basically a utopian radical agenda ideology that takes elements of the Islamic faith and basically uses them to justify oppression. And when and some people are calling for the caliphate, and they seek to, achieve that. And when you tell people that, people who are unfamiliar with it will say, you must be crazy if you honestly think that, Dexter, and I'm like, well, actually, no, it's not me that thinks that there are Islamists who are essentially working to establish some form of unified Islamic community throughout the world. The goal is to basically, overturn Western democracies, these democracies and these modern governments, to basically impose Sharia law and Islamic governance on them, even outside of Muslim-majority countries. And there are people here in the West that do, in fact, want to accomplish those goals. And the problem is that in many respects, they take advantage of the rights of religious freedom that's accorded to people to advance this ideology. And their goal ultimately is to deprive people of the very rights that they're using to undermine other people's rights. And the interesting thing about all of this is that, when you try to struggle against it, that you and point it out, you will be called an Islamophobe. But
right.
One of the things that I have reduced it to in my discussions with people is that Islamism is basically a form of Islamic supremacism or Muslim male supremacism over moderate Muslims that disagree with them, apostate Muslims, people who've left the faith, non-Muslims in general, people of other faiths, and women, and also the LGBTQ community. What I say is, and I've said it before during this interview, is that October 7th was basically an act of restorationist violence to basically, and I say to reestablish a Muslim male dominance, okay? A Muslim male supremacism over all of the communities that I just mentioned. And the interesting thing is that the people on the left in the West who are opposed to white male supremacism have essentially advocated in favor of Muslim male supremacy.
Exactly.
And I tell people who are still capable of listening to me, I say, look, whenever you see large populations of Muslims in Western cities, the safety of women, gays, and Jews goes in the tank. And that's just a fact. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali documented this in part in her book, was Prey, Prey, published, I think, in 2019, that talked about how the safety of women has declined in large part because of the arrival of significant numbers of young Muslim men from Muslim-majority environments. And it's not entirely a theological or ideological thing, but that calls for the oppression or the mistreatment of women, but it is part of it. And the problem is that the Muslim leaders, to a large extent, they're not going to fight against it, in part because there is an element that, calls for essentially the dominance of men within Islam over women. And that's something that a lot of people are struggling to rework or reinterpret in the modern world, but they're not there yet. I just visited, and I know you're going to ask me about this, but
your trip to England, right?
Yeah. I visited a number of mosques in, I went over to England, middle of December.
Yeah. In fact, I contacted you. We were going to try to do an interview, but you were too busy attending mosques in England to
right.
Right. No, it also wasn't exactly safe for you.
Well, I had an interaction towards the end of my trip that
Right. Said, I better get out of here while the getting's good and not draw any attention. And I'll explain that later. But
Okay.
one of the things that I saw, even when I didn't see any open hostility, I was at the Didsbury Mosque in Manchester, and it was a midday prayer session, and essentially there was about 70 men standing shoulder to shoulder. And they got up, they kneeled, they prostrated themselves in exact unison. That created a solidarity amongst these men that I think most institutions in the West simply cannot match.
Interesting.
And I saw it also in a much larger scale at the mosque in East London. And what happened was that I went in to essentially just kind of watch them pray, and I'd hope to talk to people, or hope to talk to the imam, but what I saw was I sat in the far right-hand corner in the back, and there was maybe several dozen people in the room, all men. And then, they started to trickle in, and then there was a steady flow, and then there was a flood. And I was essentially, for lack of a better word, the only white guy in a room full of essentially people from South Asia.
Right.
And there were some hostile looks at me. But when you saw them, do what I described just previously, I said, this represents an in-group, again, it was an in-group solidarity that is simply unmatched. And it represents an asset for extremist leaders to draw upon in their conflicts with the larger British society. And
that's a mosque that had the picture of Ali Khamenei?
No, that was the Islamic Center of England in a place called Maida Vale in London. And I need you to understand that this was the first time that I ever set foot in England outside of Heathrow. I had been in Heathrow a couple of times, and so I was there for 2 weeks. But I just knocked on the door and went into the mosque and said, "Hey, can I watch your prayer service?" And they said, "Sure." And I asked to speak to the imam, and I shook the imam's hand after the session was over. During the whole time, I was sitting in the far right back, looking at this picture, if you see in the article, of Ayatollah Khamenei. And I was like, okay. And I knew something about the mosque. I knew that they had held a prayer service or a memorial for Qasem Soleimani, who was, the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And he was a general in the Al-Quds force. And I was like, you would think that would be something that you wouldn't want to display if you wanted to have good relations with your British neighbors, some of whom have probably lost relatives to conflict as a result of, fighting against the IRGC. And I sent them an email and asked them about it. I haven't gotten a response. And then I went to the mosque in Regent's Park, and I found a book published by Daniel Akakachu, who was and this mosque was listed as the distributor, the British distributor of this very text that promotes straight up Islamism and oppression. And Daniel Akakachu has said some things that basically promote male Muslim supremacism that I spoke about previously. He's argued that, that Western notions of equality and freedom are essentially antithetical to Islam. And that's his right to say that. But the thing is that for them to be broadcasting this type of stuff makes it perfectly clear that they're not really committed to accepting the rights of religious freedom.
Well, in fact, haven't the Islamists in England gained the right to exercise Sharia law instead of British law?
Well, they have Sharia councils. And this is one of the things that other people at the Middle East Forum would be more knowledgeable about. But we've written a number of articles about them. And in particular, you can go to our website, meforum.org, and Google Sharia councils. And what they do is these councils, and we have a correspondent in England who has written about these, they basically affirm and legitimize male dominance over women in ways that I think that you and I would regard as oppressive and misogynistic. And it flies in the face of even, I think, very conservative evangelicals would look at this and shake their head and say this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so, and And the problem is that these women have rights as British citizens, and those rights are being trampled. They have legal rights to, divorce, to dividing the assets after a marriage dissolves. And the thing is that these Sharia councils, it looks to me as if they're basically used to deprive women of those rights.
From here, and what I've read, it also looks like England is not making any real effort to enforce the rights of British citizens who are Muslims, especially women who are being oppressed. They seem to be giving into the Sharia councils.
Okay. At one point, I walked into the Kilburn Islamic Center, which is near a place called Cricklewood in England. And I had been there before. Okay? I had been there maybe 2 days previous, and I kind of barged in there, and I had my laptop and my book bag and my backpack.
Right.
And I forgot to take my shoes off, and I marched into the open. And there was a guy about my size that basically said, "Take your shoes off." And he said it in broken English, and he said, "And put your backpack over in the corner." And I did it immediately. Okay?
Right.
And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry about that." And I apologized because it's their place. They can control it.
Right.
And I don't have any problems with that. Okay?
Yeah.
If you are not yet a subscriber to endtimes.com and would like to see the rest of this important report and others like it, I urge you to subscribe right now at the website endtimes.com. For only $7 a month, you will receive a wealth of information and insight from Jimmy Evans, Mark Hitchcock, and experts from around the world, including Israelis living right here in the Jewish state. Do yourself a favor. Sign up today. Then join me as together we further consider the fundamental differences between Islam, Islamism, and their direct impact on you, where you live today.